The story of the Pontiac Fiero doesn't begin with a roar of engines or the shine of chrome under showroom lights. It begins in the shadowy halls of General Motors corporate offices, where great ideas were often suffocated by politics and where the people with vision had to fight harder against their own employers than against the competition. Outside, the late 1970s were a turbulent time for the American auto industry. The golden age of muscle cars, those tire-smoking V8 machines that defined American roads in the 60s, was fading. The oil crisis of 1973 had shaken America to its core, exposing just how vulnerable Detroit's biggest automakers were. Suddenly, gas wasn't cheap anymore. Long lines at fuel stations left drivers frustrated. Buyers were rethinking what kind of cars they wanted. Meanwhile, foreign automakers like Toyota, Honda, and Volkswagen were gaining ground. With small, efficient, reliable vehicles, Detroit was in trouble. Its big cars guzzled fuel, and its smaller ones lacked the finesse of the imports. The younger generation wanted something new, a car that was fun, affordable, stylish, but also practical in a world where fuel economy mattered. But the executives at GM were cautious. They wanted safe bets. They wanted more sedans, more family cars, more of the same formula that had made them rich for decades. It was in this climate that a Turkish-born engineer named Hulki Aldakakti had a vision that bordered on rebellion. He wasn't interested in more of the same. He wanted to bring something daring, something that could rival the excitement of Ferrari or Porsche. But without the six-figure price tag, Hulki imagined a mid-engine, two-seater sports car for the American masses. The layout, which placed the engine behind the driver but ahead of the rear axle, was the kind of thing only seen on high-end European exotics. Mid-engine cars had better balance, sharper handling, and a futuristic aura. To bring that to American showrooms at an affordable price was unthinkable, but Hulki thought it was possible. There was just one problem: convincing GM's executives. At the time, suggesting that Pontiac, a brand known for muscle cars like the Firebird Trans, M and GTO should build a mid-engine sports car was like throwing a firecracker in the boardroom. GM's leaders didn't want Pontiac stepping into territory that might challenge Chevrolet's Corvette, and they especially didn't want to fund a risky sports car project at a time when the company was still reeling from the oil crisis. So Hulki did something brilliant. Instead of pitching the Fiero as a sports car, he disguised it. He went to the executives with a different story. This wasn't a flashy sports car, it was a commuter vehicle. A fuel-efficient little two-seater for everyday drivers. A car that could save fuel without sacrificing style. Behind the scenes, however, Hulki and his team knew the truth. The commuter car proposal was really a Trojan horse. Hidden inside the idea of efficiency was the skeleton of a mid-engine sports car. And once it was approved, they could quietly shape it into something that could compete with the world's best. The gamble worked. GM gave the green light, and so began one of the most daring projects in Pontiac's history. When the Pontiac Fiero finally debuted in 1984, it didn't just meet expectations, it shattered them. The name itself, Fiero, meant proud in Italian, and the car looked every bit the part. It had sleeked wedge-shaped styling, futuristic lines, and pop-up headlights that instantly gave it exotic appeal. For many buyers, it looked more like a baby Ferrari than anything GM had ever built. But it wasn't just about looks. Underneath, the Fiero was revolutionary for an American car. Its space frame construction, rigid skeleton of steel beams, was unlike anything GM had mass-produced before. Onto this skeleton, lightweight plastic body panels were bolted. This design not only made the car lighter, but also resistant to rust and easier to repair. If a panel was damaged, you could replace it like a Lego piece. The engineering was futuristic, clever, and ahead of its time. Most striking of all was the mid-engine layout. No American car at that price had ever dared to do it. By placing the engine behind the driver, weight distribution improved, handling was sharper, and the driving experience felt more like a European sports car than anything else on the market. The public went wild. Pontiac dealerships were flooded with young buyers who had never considered owning a GM product. In its first year alone, Pontiac sold more than 136,000. Fiero's an astonishing number for a completely new car. Automotive magazines hailed it as one of the most innovative American vehicles in decades. At last, it seemed Detroit had answered the challenge of the imports, not with imitation, but with bold originality. For a moment, it looked like Hulke's dream had come true. The Fiero wasn't just a car, it was a cultural phenomenon. Posters of the Fiero appeared on bedroom walls next to Lamborghinis and Ferraris. For a generation of American drivers, this was their first taste of exotic car styling at a price they could afford, but behind the celebration, a different story was unfolding. The truth was that GM's board had never really believed in the project. To keep costs low, Hulke's team was forced to use whatever parts they could scavenge from GM's existing lineup. The suspension wasn't designed for a sports car, it was borrowed from GM's economy sedans. The engine, instead of being something new and exciting, was the aging Iron Duke 4-cylinder, an uninspiring power plant that produced just 92 horsepower. On paper, the Fiero looked like a Ferrari. On the road, it often drove like a Chevy Citation. This mismatch between image and reality didn't go unnoticed. Critics began to call the Fiero a pretend sports car, one that promised performance but couldn't deliver it. Car and driver praised the styling but mocked the handling. Road and track called it innovative, but underwhelming. Buyers who expected European-like performance were left with a car that was more show than go, and then came the first signs of real trouble. Because of the cost-cutting and rush development, early Fieros suffered from quality issues. Engines were known to overheat, electrical systems were finicky, and production glitches frustrated owners. The commuter car disguise had gotten the Fiero approved, but it also left it crippled. Hulke had built the skeleton of greatness, but without GM's support, he couldn't flesh it out. Still, hope remained. The car was selling well, buyers loved the look, and Hulke's team quietly worked on improvements. But just as momentum was building, disaster struck. A disaster that would forever scar the Fiero's reputation. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. Sabotage, fires, and decline. At first glance, the Pontiac Fiero looked unstoppable. Sales were strong, the design was radical, and younger buyers, long ignored by GM, were suddenly rushing into showrooms. For a brief moment, it seemed like Detroit had found its comeback kid, but inside General Motors, the mood was far from celebratory. Behind closed doors, the Fiero was not seen as a success story. To many executives, it was a problem, a threat. GM had long operated with an internal hierarchy, and at the very top sat Chevrolet with its golden child, the Corvette. The Corvette was not just a car, it was a corporate symbol, America's only true sports car, the pride of GM. Every other division had to respect that boundary, and yet here was Pontiac, suddenly in the spotlight with a mid-engine sports car that looked exotic and captured the hearts of young drivers. Some feared that if the Fiero kept evolving, it might start stealing sales from the Corvette. The politics were brutal. The Corvette had to stay on top, no matter the cost. This meant that while Hulki Aldecakti's team was fighting to improve the Fiero, GM's upper management quietly clipped their wings. Requests for bigger budgets were denied. Plans for more powerful engines were shelved. Promising prototypes that could have transformed the Fiero into a true sports car were locked away in GM's archives. The message was clear. The Fiero would not be allowed to outshine the Corvette. So, the car that had been designed as a performance machine was hobbled from the start. Instead of the high-revving V6 Hulki wanted, the first Fieros got the outdated Iron Duke 4-cylinder. Instead of sports car suspension, the car borrowed parts from GM's economy sedans. Buyers had expected Ferrari-like thrills, but when they pressed the accelerator, they found themselves with a commuter car in disguise. The disappointment was real. Car magazines that had initially praised the Fieros, innovation soon turned critical. Looks fast, drives slow, one headline joked another. Called it a car with the heart of a Chevette dressed in Ferrari's clothes. Even loyal buyers felt betrayed, but worse was yet to come. By 1984 and 1985, horror stories began to appear. In newspapers, Fieros were catching fire. Drivers reported hearing a loud bang, followed by smoke, then flames erupting from the rear of the car. Photos of charred wrecks circulated, and soon the jokes began. Some said Fiero stood for fire everywhere, randomly on road. The truth was grim. The early Iron Duke engines had a defect, connecting rods that could snap without warning. When they did, engine oil leaked onto hot components, and the result was spontaneous fires. In some cases, the flames spread so quickly that drivers barely escaped. Hundreds of incidents were reported, and Pontiac was forced into massive recalls. For a car marketed as cutting-edge and futuristic, the headlines were devastating. The Fiero, once a symbol of American innovation, became a punchline. Buyers fled from dealerships, insurance companies raised rates. The very word Fiero was now associated with danger, unreliability, and disappointment. Inside GM, some whispered that this was exactly what the higher-ups wanted, an excuse to kill the car, whether the fires were simply the result of rushed engineering or a convenient scapegoat for executives who never wanted the Fiero to succeed. The damage was the same. The car's reputation was in flames, literally and figuratively. But Hulki and his team refused to give up. Despite the setbacks, they worked tirelessly to improve the car. By 1985, Pontiac introduced the Fiero GT, which finally offered the 2.8-liter V6 engine enthusiasts had been begging for. With 140 horsepower, the car now had some real performance to match its looks. The fastback styling gave it a more exotic profile, and handling improvements made it feel sharper on the road. For the first time, the Fiero began to live up to its promise. Reviewers softened, praising the GT as a legitimate sports car. Owners loved the newfound power. Sales started to stabilize. It seemed that maybe, just maybe, the Fiero could rise from the ashes, but GM wasn't finished clipping its wings. Instead of giving Pontiac the resources to fully develop the car, budgets were cut again. Advertising was slashed, while the Corvette got constant upgrades and national campaigns. The Fiero was left to survive with scraps. Inside Pontiac, engineers had designed prototypes with even more power, turbocharged engines, and advanced suspension systems, but these never saw the light of day. Still, the team pressed on. By 1988, they released what many consider the ultimate Fiero, the 1988 GT. This version featured an all-new suspension, upgraded brakes, and a chassis that finally delivered the handling Hulky had dreamed of a decade earlier. Road and Track praised its dynamics, even comparing it favorably to European sports cars like the Porsche 944. For the first time, the Fiero wasn't just stylish, it was genuinely world-class, and yet, this moment of triumph came at the cruelest time. Behind the scenes, GM had already made its decision. Sales had dropped sharply after the fire scandals, and executives argued the car was no longer profitable. The truth, however, was more complicated. The Corvette's position within GM had to be protected at all costs, and there was no room for another mid-engine sports car in the lineup. No matter how good the Fiero became, it was doomed. In 1988, Pontiac announced the end of production. Just 5 years after its triumphant debut, the Fiero was dead. For Hulky, it was a crushing blow. He had poured his heart into the project, fought endless battles against corporate resistance, and proved that America could build a mid-engine sports car. And just when the car had finally become the machine he had envisioned, it was taken away. For enthusiasts, it felt like a betrayal. The 1988 Fiero GT wasn't just the best version, it was proof of what the car could have been all along, if only GM had believed in it. Killing it then, just as it reached its peak, was like cutting down a tree the moment it bore fruit. The Fiero's short lifespan left behind a trail of what-ifs. What if GM had supported Hulky from the beginning? What if the fires hadn't damaged its reputation? What if the Corvette hadn't been protected at all costs? Could America have had a mid-engine sports car decades before the C8 Corvette? Those questions would linger long after the last Fiero rolled off the line. The legacy and untold truth. When the final Pontiac Fiero rolled off the assembly line in 1988, it didn't leave with fireworks or celebration. There was no parade, no farewell tour. Workers at the plant knew they were watching the end of something bigger than just a car. To many, it felt like watching a dream die quietly, but the story of the Fiero didn't end there. In fact, that's where its second life truly began. The cult that wouldn't die. In the years after its cancellation, something strange happened. People didn't forget the Fiero. Unlike other short-lived GM experiments that faded into obscurity, the Fiero found a devoted following. Why? Because it represented possibility for young car enthusiasts of the 1980s. The Fiero was their first taste of exotic styling at an affordable price. It looked like a Ferrari or Lotus, but was sold at the price of a well-optioned sedan. Teenagers hung posters of Fieros on their bedroom walls. High school parking lots across America had at least one kid who proudly showed off their little red mid-engine sports car. Even with its flaws, it gave ordinary people access to something extraordinary, and that stuck with them. Soon, Fiero owner clubs began forming. Enthusiasts swapped stories, traded parts, and refused to let the car fade into history. They organized national meets where hundreds of Fieros, GTS, SES, formulas, even rare prototypes lined up in proud defiance of GM's decision to kill the model. In online forums decades later, the same spirit continues. Owners post restoration, projects, engine swaps, and wild custom builds. Some drop in V8s, others transform Fieros into Lamborghini or Ferrari replicas. The platform, though abandoned by its maker, proved to be endlessly adaptable. The car GM tried to kill had, against all odds, achieved immortality, a shadow over GM. But the legacy of the Fiero isn't just about the cult that grew around it. It's also about what it revealed inside General Motors. The Fiero was proof that innovative, passionate engineers could beat the odds if they were given the chance. Pulki Aldecalde's team fought bureaucracy, budget cuts, and corporate sabotage, and still delivered a car that was years ahead of its time. Yet GM never truly supported them. Instead, it sacrificed the Fiero to protect the Corvette and maintain its internal pecking order. That decision haunted GM for decades. When Toyota launched the MR2 in 1984, it did everything the Fiero was supposed to do: light, sharp, reliable, and affordable. It became an instant classic. Mazda followed in 1989 with the Miata, capturing the affordable sports car market for an entire generation. Both Japanese cars became legends, while the Fiero was remembered as a cautionary tale. By refusing to let the Fiero grow, GM essentially handed the future of small sports cars to its rivals. It wasn't until 2020, more than 30 years later, that GM finally produced a mid-engine Corvette. And when it did, car enthusiasts everywhere whispered the same. Thought Pulki was right all along. The irony was brutal. The very idea GM had once sabotaged the mid-engine American sports car had finally become its flagship. If the Fiero had been allowed to evolve naturally, the US could have beaten Ferrari and Lamborghini at their own game decades earlier. Redemption in the shadows. But there's another truth that often gets overlooked. The Fiero quietly influenced GM in ways the public never saw. The car's innovative space frame construction, a steel skeleton covered by composite body panels, was revolutionary for its time. This approach later inspired design principles used across GM vehicles. The lessons learned from the Fiero's failures, from overheating engines to cost-cutting disasters, shaped how GM approached quality control in the years that followed. In other words, the Fiero left fingerprints on GM's future, even if the company never admitted it. And then there was Pulki Aldecalde. After the project ended, he didn't fade away. He remained within GM, still designing, still fighting for ideas others thought impossible. His story became something of a legend among engineers, the man who tried to give America its first mid-engine sports car and almost succeeded. What the Fiero means today. Ask any car enthusiast today about the Pontiac Fiero, and the response is rarely neutral. Some remember the fires, the jokes, the underwhelming early models. Others remember the style, the uniqueness, the way it made them feel like they owned a slice of Ferrari for a fraction of the price. But nearly all agree on one thing: the Fiero deserved better. It was the underdog, the misfit, the car that fought its own company harder than it fought its competitors. It showed us how corporate politics could kill brilliance, and how passion alone wasn't always enough to win. And yet, it also showed us the resilience of car culture. That even when manufacturers turn their backs, enthusiasts can keep a dream alive. Today, pristine Fieros are collector's items. The rare 1988 GT models command respect at auctions. Custom builds with V8 swaps can steal the spotlight at car shows. And for thousands of owners, the Fiero remains more than just a car. It's a badge of defiance, proof that sometimes the best machines are the ones the world wasn't ready for. The untold truth. Here lies the untold truth of the Pontiac Fiero. It wasn't just a car, it was a rebellion. It was proof that engineers could defy corporate rules and bring a radical idea to life. Proof that affordable sports cars didn't have to come from Japan or Europe, they could be built in Detroit. Proof that even when a dream is sabotaged, it can survive in the hands of people who refuse to forget. Yes, the Fiero had flaws. Yes, it caught fire sometimes, literally. But it also caught fire in another way, in the hearts of enthusiasts who refuse to let it die. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the Fiero still matters today. Because in a world where cars are becoming appliances, the Fiero reminds us that passion, risk, and rebellion are what make car culture truly alive. So, the next time you see one rumble past on the street, a little wedge-shaped Pontiac, mid-engine, with its pop-up headlights glinting in the sun, remember this: you're not just looking at a car, you're looking at a ghost of what could have been, and a symbol of what car culture will always fight to keep alive. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic automotive adventures. Your support keeps these stories alive